Hi, everybody. This is Pastor Chad with FBC's So That Missions podcast. Today we have a guest with us. His name is Jimmy Dorrell. He's the founder of Mission Waco, Mission World. He's retired from that now, but he's doing great things, so hope you guys enjoy his story. Hi, and welcome to Season 4 of FBC Mission So That podcast. This is an encouraging place to hear how God is working in and around us. We know that He blesses His people so that they can bless the world around them. And we're going to be discussing how to join God in all that He is doing. Why is God working in our life, church, and community? It's so that through us, the world will know that He is near. Hey everybody, thank you so much for jumping in today and listening to FBC's So That podcast. I'm here in the studio with my friend and one of my mentors, Jimmy Dorrell. He was a founder of Mission Waco. How are you doing, Jimmy?
Great to be here.
Great to have you with us today. He's going to be our instructor for our Perspectives Lesson 12 this evening that talks about Christian community development and what that means. And so we're so glad to get a few minutes with you. One of the things we'd like to do to start out with is just get to know you a little bit. So tell us just a little bit about yourself, Jimmy. Tell me about your family and how you guys are doing.
Doing great and good to see you. I grew up in Conroe, but I'm so old, there wasn't even a lake in Conroe when I left to go to Baylor.
Oh, gosh.
And all of a sudden they built the lake after I left, and all of Houston showed up and made it into a whole different town than I grew up in.
It's a tourist place. It's a place to go run your boats.
Yeah, I was just it was kind of a Leave It to Beaver town back when I was there. But anyway, went on from there to Baylor, and Baylor was much more affordable back then. It was $25 an hour, but we only won 4 football games in 4 years, so you get what you pay for.
$25 an hour. I can't even imagine.
No, you can't buy a book for half that. So
no. Just let us know, how old are you now, Jimmy?
I'm 74.
74?
Yeah.
Man, you're a young guy for 74.
Well, I just had my 50th Beta reunion a couple years ago, and I was thanking God when I left there because so many of them were on walkers and talking about their triple bypass. And I thought, Lord, thanks for these great years because I feel good, and I'm privileged to be able to do a lot of things still that I did when I was younger. But
I had lunch today with a guy that's 78, and he looks like he's feeling every bit of it, you know, and so it's pretty amazing you're looking great, bud. That's awesome.
Did Baylor for those 4 years, but while in Waco, I youth directed at Highland Baptist Church. It was a smaller church, but it was back then, but a really good place for me, and just a couple of years older than some of the kids in the youth group, and really invested my life in them while I was in Baylor. It was one of those great situations where you're on the campus and in the community at the same time, and it's really not easy for a lot of students in any campus to do that. But I was spending 25 hours a week at least in the community, and it was really transformative to go to the schools and get to know them and do ministry with them. And so those were good years. I learned a lot. One of the things I'll even share tonight is had my first encounter in a poverty neighborhood. Was asked by a African American pastor named Reverend Pinckney to come over to a part of town called No Man's Land. It was a really poor area, no running water, floodplain, houses falling down, and he was pastor of St. Mary's Baptist Church.
St. Mary's Baptist Church.
I didn't know you could have a St. Mary's Baptist Church, but a real nice guy, a few years older than me, and asked me if I would bring the youth group over there to help do a vacation Bible school for the kids. And
so Highlands Baptist Church youth group going to No Man's Land.
Yep. And it was, again, this was a very racialized world still back then. It was hippie culture and all kind of different things going on in that world. But with the parents' permission, we went over, and looking back, those years were transformative for them. It was really one of those on-the-ground deals, and you get to see people of different color, different background, and it just had high impact on the youth group. And so I'm such a missions guy. You know that's supposed to be doing, but I saw it early on in my ministry, and did that 3 or 4 years with them, and then went from there to the state home. I left the church. A new pastor came in, and priorities were youth directors. And I remember going to the first day on my new job was recreation supervisor of a children's home called the Waco State Home. These were kids taken away from their parents by the state of Texas because of dependency or neglect. They had abused them or whatever, all these horrible things that happened in their lives. And so they would put them in the Waco State Home, and it was there about 250 kids that I started a whole new understanding of how do you love people. These were tough kids, ages 6 to 17. Got cussed out the first day by a 6-year-old and stopped fights when they started playing basketball, and the whole week was awful. It was just terrible. And I was so mad at God because I had thought I was, really special because I was a Sunday school kid. I had a 7-year Sunday school attendance pin back home, and I thought I was a Pharisee of Pharisees, and I'm sure I was. And so really it was the end of that week I had to have this little talk with God to remind him how important I thought I was, and he didn't share some of my values of Sunday school pins and not cussing and doing things that I'm glad I didn't do those things, but I was just in a different world.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I had to have a real long talk that night with God when I walked around in the park, and it was kind of one of those conviction nights where the Holy Spirit spoke in a way that I could really understand and let me know that, look, you talk all the religious language, but here are these kids that need to be loved more than anybody. And
Sure.
I had parents who loved me. I had a good background. And I had to learn to love kids, 15-year-old tough guys that, tough and had nothing to do with anybody that was in authority. But I could see the little boy inside of those older kids, and they were so hungry to be loved. But it was not easy, and I think those 3 years, out of all the education I've had, all the training I've had, really was the formative training that made me think the way I think today about the urban center
Sure.
and the role of the church there.
Interesting, man. That's there's a home like that here in Boerne. It's called Meadowlands Children's Home, and it's children who are not fit to go into the foster care program because of their needs. And we have a number of even some people in our class tonight that work there and are really involved in that. So they're gonna identify with some of the stories really well.
Yeah.
So tell us about your family. That'd be great.
So while I was at the state home, my wife was a volunteer from Baylor that came over to work with the kids. And so we met there on the common ground of both caring for them. And she was a horse person, and she'd go out. We had a bunch of worthless Shetland ponies that nobody could tame, but she did, and got the kids to riding them and teaching some skills with the horse stuff. So we dated and ended up getting married, went on to seminary from there. And so there in seminary, this another kind of complex reality for me was talking theology in the morning. I loved it, and yet then in the afternoon my job was to work in inner city at the public housing. And again, families that were dysfunctional, lots of challenges I never imagined. And I was trying to figure out, where's the church? And the church wasn't down there. And I was concerned that we were so afraid of the urban poor that we had walked away out of concerns for safety and all these other issues. But I found just the opposite. I found they were just people, and they just need to be loved. And so the 3 years in seminary were a similar situation of God continued to remind me of a calling that was growing in us. So left seminary and went to work with Ralph Neighbor in Houston. Ralph was a renewal church guy, and I needed to see the church begin to break out of the old shackles of doing just institutional church, and Ralph was that guy. He was a big denominational guy with evangelism, but his heart was for the people who had left the church, the postmoderns, especially in Houston, where so many different cultural groups. And so we went to Korea to study the cell group movement, and spent 3 or 4 weeks over there at Youngie Cho's church, where they had built this incredibly large church in a Buddhist culture that was really built around small cell groups in the big church. And they were the ones that took care of the poor and did things that mattered for ministry. And we brought that model back to Houston and did that for the next 3 or 4 years. And it was very powerful. We saw a lot of change in Houston.
It really, that particular work of Ralph Neighbor in Houston kind of founded the cell group movement that then made really major impacts across the country. Like that was one of the the beginnings of that whole idea was from that work. So it's interesting. I didn't know you were part of that.
Yeah, that was.
In all the conversations we've had, that one hasn't come up before.
In fact, it was so funny because when he wrote Survival Kit for New Christians, he used Jimmy and Janet for the kids in the story, and so, or Jim and Jan, I think, instead of our full name.
Jim and Jan.
But anyway, Ralph was honest and he was straightforward and just loved him, man. He's still alive. He's about 92 or 3 or 4 now, and I check on him periodically. But he really did. He came for me at the right time because of the chance of getting cynical in a church that's kind of become inward. He was just the opposite, and I needed that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So you guys went all over the place then. You're talking about like Houston. You're away from Waco now. You're not from Waco, so you end up back there. So we'll get back to Waco. But how did you end up starting Mission Waco, Mission World?
After we had finished 3 years, the challenge for me in Houston was we were working mostly with wealthy kids, and we knew something had happened in our sense of call to the poor. So to honor that, we were trying to decide, should we be long-term missionaries among people group or in the poor of the world. So we had a 1-year-old child by then, but it's time to see the world. So we sold our house and bought tickets around the world, and for the next 4.5 months, went around the world. And
literally.
Yeah, literally. I mean, we went all over. The wall was still up. We smuggled Bibles into the Eastern Bloc. We did things in Nepal and Korea and Thailand, just literally lots of countries, just to be out there and saw poverty, saw people who didn't even know the name of Jesus, saw the brokenness of so many needs. India was our biggest challenge because when you get there, you see not only so many unreached people, but you see all these different kinds of religions, the smells, the taste, the heat, all that in Calcutta. So we went over to find Mother Teresa's work there in Kalighat and went to that location back in the red light district and didn't find her initially, but we started working with the Sisters of Charity and working with these 100 men and 100 women each that were in their last days of life, and the sisters would take care of them, give them a IV or clean them up, and we'd wash towels and do whatever we needed to for them. End up going into some of the slums, even a leper slum or two. So it was pretty intense. One day we actually asked, "Does Mother Teresa ever come back around?" She said, "Oh yeah, she lives right over there, a little bitty house, and or maybe even an apartment." And we said, "Well, can we go over there?" And she said, "Yeah, she just got back from a trip." And we went over, knocked on the door, and she answered the door. And we thought, I would have had 3 levels of security if I was her. But she opened the door, invited us in. So for the next 30, 40 minutes, we got to talk with her about her life and the things that she was doing. And then she said to us as we left, just like she probably says to everybody, "You don't have to come to Calcutta. Go find your own Calcutta." And I remember that very distinctly. And we went back and worked a few more days and then came on home from there. And so we were exhausted, 4.5 months of traveling, seeing the whole world in so many ways. It was not pretty, but also still the hope of salvation. So we came back to Waco because that was where we'd been involved before, and decided that we couldn't go back to middle-class America. We weren't blaming middle-class people. We were just knowing that we had seen the brokenness, and for us to go live as if it didn't exist would be hypocritical. So we found a house in the middle of the old neighborhood that had transferred from being a white middle-class neighborhood. Now as the poor moved in, who were mostly African-American then, the white flight happened and to the suburbs, and they ran away, and the businesses went with them, and the churches also went with them. So pretty blighted neighborhood, but we found an old beat-up house. It was a large house, 4,000 square foot house, across the street from a bar called the Chat and Chew. The prostitutes worked the street, and the crack dealers were down the corner. House was in terrible shape. It was a slumlord house where they would buy these old houses and cram them full of people. And there were 2 mentally ill veterans on one little apartment that he'd made, and upstairs a kid that had just ravaged the place, rats and roaches all over. Downstairs there was a lady we called the Cat Lady that had 40 cats in a 1-bedroom apartment.
Oh, my goodness.
And so we stood out in the street, and we bought this 4,000 square foot house for $12,000. And we say, just like everybody, location, location, location. It goes both ways. And so the house is in terrible shape. I'm not a carpenter, but we learned how to sheetrock and paint and fix and clean. And so I took another job just to have income. We were having a second baby. And our goal there was not to go fix people. We knew it was about relationships. And so that core value, working with all the children and teens and urban center people, they were not a project. They were going to be our friends and our neighbors. And so we just began to meet them. Janet was incredible with the moms. We built a basketball court at our house, half court when we could afford it, and then doubled it to a full court. Still today, 45 years later, we're still playing. The kids are on the basketball court. Even last night as I got in my car to let them come have a place to play. And so we began children's clubs off of that at their request. We called it King's Clubs, and then we did Teen Club, and Janet got to know enough of the moms. They did mothers groups, and everything grew up organically. It was just a natural relational way to do this thing. And so we eventually I got some funding, and I was able to leave that other job after 8 years, and we started officially Mission Waco Mission World. And the title of Mission World was later, even though we were global people. So we been doing that for, I guess, probably 29 years before I retired. I brought somebody in to take my place a couple of years before that, and then got to the edge and let him take over. But it's still our neighborhood, still our community, and of course we are also global people still, so we work in Haiti, Mexico City, and India, and Janet does most of the global stuff, even though we'll go together. But the same principles of Christian community development.
So that's what tonight's about. There's so much we could talk about. Church Under the Bridge, Texas CCDA on a national scale. There's so much that we could spend some time on. But let's transition and talk about what is Christian community development. How are we going to introduce it to the class tonight? What are some just simple principles that someone listening tonight who's never heard anything about it should take away?
About 2 years of being in the neighborhood, doing CCDA kinds of things, not knowing what to call it, somebody said there's a group of people that sound like you. They're called CCDA, Christian Community Development Association. They were relatively newly formed, and they were having a conference in Denver. And so we went there, and it was like we found our best friends.
It's like your tribe.
They were our people. They thought like people. Us. They working in inner city Chicago, Atlanta, L.A., you name it. And they were fun. These were not grumpy old Christians. These were fun people, but they still had this sense of passion for the church as well as for the urban centers. And so I got on the national board over the years and did that for about 10 years. And it was in those relationships we learned from each other. Nobody was writing back then, so through the years, a lot of us have written different things to help people get it. But there's 8 basic principles, but it's really mostly just listening to the people. How do you let them be a part of the solution? We work from this model that says the people with the problem must be a part of the solution of the problem. I'm not here to fix them. I'm there to be their friend. And we say this a lot, that they can tell in about 5 minutes if they're a project or if they're a person to the persons that are talking to them. And sometimes missional people mean well, but we go down to fix people. We go down and thinking, how can I make something happen? I can see the results of it, and it really misses some of the key values of just being relational. And so we did that, and I became friends with all kinds of folks, and we began to emulate those models in the neighborhood, listening to the neighborhood, how you empower people instead of do relief. We're much more on the empowerment model, and it just takes more time. You can't get the results of the fun of giving somebody $20, but it doesn't, as we've learned through the years, lots of people have done the research, that $20 really doesn't change their behavior.
Right.
And if we're going to really make a difference, we have to build relationships, and there may be times we do benevolence, but how we do benevolence doesn't look like most churches do it today.
Sure. No, I spent 10 years working on the border, and so much of that effort is similar. Like, how do you help people who are in crisis, who are in transition in crisis? They're going through intense difficulty. Well, you don't help them the same way that you help everybody else, and you've got to figure out a lot of different things along the way. Sometimes we're going to have a couple hours with people, so how can we help them? It's give them a shower, it's give them some food, it's give them some clean clothes, and that may be all we can do. And that too, we want to give them more. We want to be able to give them the gospel. We want to give them, but they're not in a place where they can even hear it or receive it.
And sometimes I think it's just sitting with them, just being there. We don't see that as ministry sometimes because we want to have some result takeaway. But I honestly challenge folks just to learn how to sit and be, and let God's Holy Spirit do the next steps.
Ask those hard questions. And man alive, people's hearts open up. Again, I use the word a lot, human thriving, right? How do you build foundations towards human thriving? And there's so much in this world that tries to take away that thriving, the dignity, all the pieces to it. Yep. And so people, you meet them and they're just reduced to nothing. And if you can just meet them just as a person for a moment and recognize the dignity they have innately, sometimes they open up and it changes their world. Many ways you have led me, Jimmy, many conversations over the years. One that stands out to me the most was when I was living in Beaumont. We were talking about how to start something like Mission Waco, Mission Beaumont kind of ideas that we were rolling around and thinking through, and working with some inner city missions already, some inner city leaders and pastors, and trying so hard to figure out how to connect your Anglo, almost suburban world with those inner city needs, and seeing all of the just craziness, right? Everything from the many churches that show up and give it sandwiches and pizzas and whatever else one day to the next. And then you find a few guys that are saying things like, we don't give handouts, we give a hand up, and they're walking alongside, they're building a relationship, and their ministry looks so different than the ministry that we were accustomed to in our churches. And I feel like you gave me a really good encouragement one day. We were talking about homeless ministry, and you said, Chad, don't start with homeless ministry. That's one of the hardest. Start with the people who are in poverty who don't want to stay there. Like, go find an apartment complex where people are paying their rent and see if you can find some families that are struggling, but you can help them, and they'll take some steps forward. And it blew me away because I don't think I've never seen it like that. Homeless just tends to be the most visible community in the inner city, and people want to say, if we can change their world, then we can, make a difference. But I had already, by the time we had that conversation, spent almost 20 years in Seattle and then in Beaumont trying to engage different aspects of homelessness. And in that whole time, at that point, probably 18 literal years in that kind of work, seeing one guy go off the streets, all of the people we interact with, one guy transformed to be a home loving father connected to his family that he had lost before, like all of that work. And so one transformed life. And I know that there's places where there's much better opportunity than that. And even when you visit Church Under the Bridge in Waco, you see communities. But one of the things is you're not trying to necessarily change them. You're just trying to love them. You're going to connect them. And some of these guys, I think you also taught me the term chronic homelessness. Like, some of these guys are never going to feel comfortable in a systematic life like ours, and so they're not going to ever, no matter how much help you could pay for their apartment forever, and they may not live in it. And so tell us a little bit about how if you drive around Boerne, Boerne is the perfect example of a suburb community outside of San Antonio. Lots of affluent people who love the Lord, who want to help. There's a couple of ministries are even connected to San Antonio's Church Under the Bridge. There's some ministries out of FBC here that are really involved in that. How would you suggest somebody that just wants to get involved? They know that God's called them to help. They're not sure what's the best way to start.
Well, and just let me affirm what you said again. And I know that the visible homeless are the ones that we most often are confronted with. We're sitting there in our car, and they're right there out on the corner, and it's kind of a lose-lose situation. If you give them money, you think, well, maybe they're going to buy some liquor or something and take advantage, or if I don't give them money, then I feel guilty because I've got money and they don't.
Matthew 25 says, if you don't help these, you don't help Jesus. Like, what am I going to do with this?
And so as you well remember, that whole idea that they're my friends. I mean, these are people I know, and we talk about these things together, homeless and not homeless. The mentally ill is a huge section of I guess they're probably one of the largest groups of the mentally ill, being the homeless ones. Also with addiction. So you put those two together, we call that dually diagnosed. And unless you're a trained social worker, there are not many things you're going to be able to do as a person that's parking next to them on the car to be able to help. And so you have to give yourself permission not to give them $1. Not that you didn't care. And you have to realize that God's picture of who you need to connect with may be 50 more people that are not on the corner, but they're invisible homeless, and they're the ones that do need help. And like you said, if it's one little thing you did so they could keep their house or get their kid back in school or whatever it is, there's so many ways to more practically meet the needs. Doesn't mean there aren't people called to work with the chronically homeless.
Sure, of course.
And we affirm those, and we do that. I have a homeless shelter. We're building tiny houses right now in Waco for the homeless that are chronic. So that's my world too. But for the average Christian, don't start there. That's just too hard. And again, a book that I want to remind you of is written by Fickert and Colbert, When Helping Hurts, is probably the best book out there to help you read and understand the principles of helping. The title itself, When Helping Hurts, how to keep from hurting yourself and those that you're trying to help. It's just a reminder that our simplistic culture of affluence thinks giving people money is the way to help, and it's not. There's so many other aspects of it, and so we have to back off that and think, how can I learn those skills? How can I learn how to use money differently, and how do I build friendships with people that culturally and sociologically I'm just so different from? But it can happen. Some of my best friends are some of the most messed up people, but I just love them. I'll never go back to middle class church. My church is so wild and different and full of fun people that are real and genuine. They're not playing the churchy games. They're just real.
We got about 5 minutes left, so tell me a little about your people. Tell me about your church. Like I love it. There's so many stories you've told over the years, so I'd love to hear like what stands out. How long ago did you start Church on the Bridge?
Church Bridge is 31 years old now.
31 years old.
Yeah, and started with a Bible study. Janet and I were eating breakfast at a Taco Cabana out on the front porch there and across from the new interstate bridge, and looked over and saw the mentally ill and addicts underneath the bridge where they slept. And we said, we don't understand homelessness. Let's go invite them to breakfast. So they came over, we ate together, and they told us their stories. Had I experienced their life like they did, I'd been on the streets, and so would most people. But they said, this is fun. Let's do it next week. So they brought a few more friends, and the third week, breakfast cost me over $250. And I said, guys, we can't afford this. And they said, well, why don't you come over and do a Bible study under the bridge? So the fun part was, it wasn't me pushing my way in. It was God leadership through them to let us go. And so we went over, and it was loud, and you could hardly hear, and there was interruptions, nothing like you trained to do in seminary, and
tractor trailers over 35 nonstop.
Yeah. But we finished up that first morning. Janice plays the guitar and sings, and so they said, hey, this is great, let's do it next week. So we came back, and we've been coming back now for 31 years. And so it's just this, and now what's happened is it's become a multicultural church. So it's not just a poor people church. It is blacks and whites and browns and rich people and poor people, Baylor professors sitting next to mentally ill folks. I mean, it's just this crazy diversity, which to me is the picture of the church. And it's hard enough to deal with the racial issues if you're economically the same, but then you add the economics to it, and there's some, and we do not go down to do church for the poor. We do church with the poor. That's a strong statement.
I want to hear about that too. One of my favorite stories, you talk about your worship team and some of the people that have been a part of it over the years. It's Americans have such this high focus on quality and excellence, and especially when it comes to worship. I hear this, and I've heard it. I've been an interim worship leader at times. I've been. And this, it's almost like God deserves our best, therefore only the best can be presented. And it always just kind of sticks with me in this place from like,
Let me tell you a story. This is glad you're talking about music. So I may have told you this before, but we had a guy get off the bus one time, and you could tell something wasn't right. He'd ridden over on one of our vans, and African-American, you could tell he was talking to himself a little bit, and he came over and mumbled something we didn't understand, and he said it 3 or 4 times. Somebody said, I think he's asking, can he be on the worship team? And sure, in our church you can. And so we put him up on the bongos, and he played on the bongos and knocked them off, and they went out in the street, and we had to go get him. That didn't work. And next week he showed up, and we said, okay, Patrick, you just we're going to build draw a box here on the stage, and you stand there and just direct everything. So he directed it all, but he got out of his box and knocked over the music stands, and that got the musicians a little messed up. So we figured out the third week how to do it. We bought him an electric guitar. We just never plugged him in. So for the last 12 years, he's played the guitar. Not really. There's no music. There's no sound coming out, but he's fast, really, hand going back and forth as fast as he can. And then he'll hold up the other hand, and he'll sign language. He doesn't really sign language, but nobody knows that, because we had a lady come up with tears in her eyes one time and said, thank y'all so much for having a deaf ministry. We don't have a deaf ministry. It's just Patrick. So he is our validity. I mean, it's people like him who are engaged with us. He's a friend. And when he's not there, everybody wonders, where's Patrick? So there's this whole different way of understanding church when it's that disorganized and yet still relational.
And when anybody can bring their best, like it may not be the best. It's not going to win it's not going to be awards, but it's going to be someone worshiping God with all their heart. What else could you ask for?
And even, I mean, we just can't give ourselves permission to think that if it's okay to sing badly if you're singing to the Lord. And so even your choirs, so it's like we've just built this professionalism around church that is not really valid sometimes.
Absolutely, and I get it. I get it. We spend lots of resources to have nice lighting and stage and sound equipment to make it all sound great, so you want qualified people. So I'm not bashing that we should give our best, but there's spaces where everyone should be free and should worship as the Lord leads them, even if it's a one-string unplugged electric guitar. It's just a beautiful picture and a beautiful story. Jimmy, all over what you've been invested in the last 30 years is those kind of markers. It's these moments and places where you've seen people as valuable, even when they're in the midst of what most people look at and say this is a train wreck. And yet, in the middle of every train wreck, there's people. And those people are suffering, they're hurting. Like you said, our society does not know how to care for mentally ill or addicted leaders. And you combine the two, and now you've got mentally ill and addicted people. Their opportunity to thrive has just been demolished.
And a thing that we don't understand at the church is that there is a place for mentally ill people to be engaged, but there is another place for wealthy, powerful people to help change the systemic injustice. And so what happens is, when I work with the poor, we are dealing with issues. The prison system's a mess. The mental health systems are a mess. The education system for poor kids. There's so many broken systems that we work in that can be changed, but it takes powerful people talking to congressmen and fighting for the minimum wage in Texas, still $7.25 an hour. People say, go get a job. They've got a job, in many cases 2 jobs. You can't make it in $7.25 an hour. So who's going to give them a $12 an hour instead of $7.25? Those systems are part of the Christian call, but we don't know how to do that in our churches. We just think we've got to go touch somebody. But there are people in your church and mine and other churches that, if they got together, they can influence some changes that help the broken folks, that would help them get off the streets.
And there's so many great examples of those. HEB Foundation has done the mini house village outside of Austin. I viewed a few years ago as part of the CCDA Texas conference, and that model has become something that's become.
We broke ground. We break ground this summer on 40 homes.
So 40 homes in Waco, and I've heard interest in that kind of thing around San Antonio. They're just trying to find a place that will be willing to host it, which apparently is a challenge. Every community is nervous about opening any part. Like I can't imagine where Boerne would want to put 50 houses for homeless people.
when Alan Graham finishes his 4th phase there in Austin, they're going to have 1,400 homes.
1,400 homes. Is that the one that the HEB? That's the one we toured.
Yeah.
It was 10 years ago or 8 years ago. So, wow, 1,400 homes. Yeah. I'd love to another podcast sometime is to find out how that's going. Obviously, it's growing.
We're down there probably once every month at least, because Alan's been a friend for 10 or 12 years, and they have learned a lot and don't mind sharing that information. So they do some training. It's also online. You can go to Community First Village.
Okay,
and it's a great video of that work.
Yeah, I'll definitely check that out. Well, Jimmy, thank you so much for taking some time. Anything else? Any last words you would give to our listeners? A church in an affluent town on the outside of San Antonio. This is like the gateway to the whole country, they say. What would you encourage them to think about when they're trying to figure out how to balance these needs with what God's called them to?
I think that we've got to realize that we've got to help the church be the church. And I love the church, and I'm not giving up on it. I see the messes we've made in so many ways. But I think we need passionate people within the church that want more. And even if you have a few people be the salt, the yeast, the light in those situations to help us grow. And it does cause challenges. I mean, there's always going to be, when you upset the apple cart, we've been doing it this way for 20 years, but the church in America and Europe and Canada together. 53,000 people leave the church every week and don't come back. It's overwhelming, and we're just kind of dazed and not talking about that in our churches. But the postmodern culture is walked away from the church because we're not authentic enough for so many of the younger ones that says it's not real.
Well, again, there's another topic that could be a great podcast, the social justice versus evangelism. It's like there's these two worlds that are so divided from each other. But we see the life of Christ. He does both. He cares for the needs and he meets the spiritual needs. Physical needs and spiritual needs are not separated. I love even the concept, love the Lord your God, our heart, soul, mind, and strength. People love that. And the next one says, love your neighbor yourself. And if you really look at it, those two things are so connected that you separate one from the other, and that they both are not what they're supposed to be. If you take away the neighbor, then you're not following God well. And if you're not loving God with all your heart, you're definitely not loving your neighbor well. Those two things are so completely dependent on each other. Jimmy, it's in people like you that I get to see that lived out, and it has been a blessing for me personally to get to know you and Janet. And so I'm so thankful that you're with us. Those of you who are listening today, hope that you've enjoyed our conversation. Jimmy is in Waco. He is a part of our Texas community. And so hopefully if you wanted to get in touch with him, you could. But reach out to us here at the church. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Jimmy, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
God bless you, brother. And those of you who are listening, have a wonderful day. And remember why we're doing this. It's so that as God blesses us, we can be a blessing to those around us. Have a wonderful day. God bless. We are so thankful that you joined our podcast today. We would love to hear any feedback you may have for us. Remember, Psalm 67 says, "May God be gracious to us and bless us, and make his face shine on us, so that your ways may be known on earth and your salvation among all nations." Don't forget why the Lord blesses us. It's so that we can be a blessing to those around us. Until next time, God bless.